Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Matt stood in the living room of the Abbott house feeling the verity weigh him down like a huge surge about to crash. He took a breath and told Jack and Diane about his parents. The room was quiet, like it was holding its breath. The pressure was so thick, you could nearly cut it with a cutter. Jack stood still looking like he was in charge. His face showed he didn't believe it and was upset. He looked at Diane, whose eyes were wide with excitement like she was staying for commodity she knew was coming. Her hands were clasped tight like she was getting ready for a shock. Matt felt like it was a moment his voice was shaking, but he was determined. He started to tell them about his history, about how he'd been living a taradiddle. He said that for a time he'd been told effects that were true effects that were meant to control his life. He said that people had hidden the verity under falsehoods, partial trueness, and effects they didn't want him to know. Matt told them about the nights he stayed awake wondering who he really was. He was telling Jack and Diane that his whole life had been a story made up by others, and he was trying to figure out what was real and what was not. Matt said he'd been living with questions about his identity for a long time. The verity was hard for him to say out loud. He knew he'd to tell them. Matt wanted them to know what had been going on and how it had affected him. He took another breath and kept talking, trying to explain everything that had happened. The room was still quiet. Matt could feel that Jack and Diane were hearkening, trying to understand what he was saying. Matt was talking about his life, about the verity, and about how he'd been trying to find out who he really was. The late night hours when I am awake, I suppose, about the strange effects that happened when I was little. There are numerous stories and rumors about my early life that I've tried to forget. I really want to know who I'm and where I come from. But at the time I'm spooked that if I find out the verity it'll change everything I suppose I know about myself and my life. And that's enough scary study. The mysterious circumstances of my early life, the rumors, they're always there, and I'm always wondering, who am I really? Now the pieces were falling into place. The pieces were showing a family history that would change how Jack and Diane saw him. This family history would also affect Genoa City in ways. It was going to be a change for Genoa City. The pieces of his family history were coming together. It was going to have a big impact on Jack and Diane and the whole megacity of Genoa City. Matt's father, he said with a pause, was Victor Newman, a man who had an impact on the megacity. Victor Newman was an important person, and a lot of people knew him. He was someone who could make big effects be. His presence was felt far and wide. Matt's mama, he continued, was Nikki Newman, a woman who was veritably strong and passionate. She had been through a lot in her life. It hadn't always been easy for her. Diane's hand went to her mouth as she tried to understand the connection between Matt, the boy she had watched grow up, and the notorious couple who had been a part of Genoa City's history. Jack tried to keep a face, but he was surprised and his mind was contending. He was allowing about how this news would affect the connections between people in the megacity and how it would change effects. Matt saw that his musketeers were surprised. He kept talking. He told them about the times he'd been through and how he'd plotted to understand who he was and where he fit in. He'd heard whispers and rumors. He'd put together suggestions from letters and exchanges he'd eavesdropped. Each piece of information had helped him to understand the verity, a verity that he'd been hysterical of but also wanted to know. When Matt finished talking, the room was silent for a time. Jack's mind was reeling from the shock. He was feeling defensive and curious. Diane felt sorry for Matt, respected his courage. She knew that telling people about his parents wasn't about claiming a name or a heritage, but about accepting a verity that would change his life. Matt felt a sense of relief when he saw how his musketeers were replying. He knew that effects would not be easy and that there would be challenges ahead. He also knew that he'd eventually been honest, and that felt good. The verity was out. It would have a big impact on Genoa City. Jack was pacing back and forth, trying to suppose about what this would mean for business and connections. Diane went over to Matt, put a hand on his shoulder, offering him comfort and support. Outside, people were starting to talk about Matt's family, and the news was spreading snappily. Matt was anxious about what would be, but he also felt free. He knew that he'd have to deal with the consequences of his verity. He was ready to face them. of the innumerable relations that would now be seen in an entirely different light, of alliances that might shift, commitment that might be tested, and the ineludible competitions that would arise as buddies, rivals, and family likewise reused the seismic impact of his concession. And yet, amid the whirlwind of emotion, the fear, and the anticipation, there was an unarguable sense of commission, a recognition that claiming his heritage, admitting his roots, and revealing the verity to Jack and Diane wasn't simply an act of exposure, but one of recovery, a bold statement of identity, rigidity, and courage. And as Jack ultimately stopped pacing, turning to look at Matt with an amalgamation of pride, concern, and the onsets of acceptance, and Diane, her eyes shimmering with emotion, jounced in quiet solidarity, the three of them together formed a tableau of exposure, concession, and the complex beauty of domestic bonds. And in that moment, Matt realized that while the trip ahead would be tumultuous, marked by dramatic competitions, emotional reckonings, and the ever-present chaos of Genoa city life, he would take in the most critical first step, claiming the verity of who he was, connecting with the heritage of his parents, and sticking himself not simply as an unresistant observer of the municipality's drama, but as an active party in shaping its future. Alive that the impacts of this concession would ripple outward, touching everyone from Victor, who would really have his own responses ranging from pride to strategic calculation, to Nikki, whose maternal instincts and emotional depth would be stirred by the consummation of her son's actuality and identity, to the myriad of buddies, foes, and familiarity who had always suspected about Matt's origins and would now have their curiosity satisfied, along with their intentions either thwarted or enabled. And as the day faded into evening, the Abbott mansion, once a silent validation to innumerable plays, came the stage for yet another chapter in the no-ending saga of love, dedication, ambition, and the involved web of mortal connections that defines the young and the restless. And Matt, standing tall despite the earthquake of jitters still coursing through him, allowed himself a temporary smile, knowing that the verity had ultimately been spoken, the formerly conceded, and a new chapter in his life and the lives of those around him had begun, one that would be defined by the raw, undressed reality of family, identity, and the continuing drama that makes Genoa City the heart of Cleaner Pieces legend. When Matt said he was giving up, it was like you could hear the words bouncing off the walls of the Abbott house. Then it got really quiet, like the walls were soaking up what he said. For a second it felt like time was moving really slow. Jack, Diane, and Matt just stood there not knowing what to think. They were all wondering what was going on, and what would happen next. Their lives and the whole town of Genoa City were about to change. Jack was the one to speak up because he always thinks ahead. He talked in a calm voice, but you could tell he did not believe what he was hearing. He asked Matt, "How long have you known this?" And Matt, swallowing hard, his throat tight with the trouble to hold back the alluvion of feelings hanging to overwhelm him, admitted that he discovered fractions over time, pieces of exchanges, cryptic letters, transitory expressions from those who had known further than they revealed, but it had taken months of meticulous disquisition, insomniac nights, and careful deduction to put the mystification together and arrive at the inarguable verity. And Diane, her aspect, fixed on Matt with an admixture of concern and admiration, pressed a gentle hand to his arm, asking in a tale, "And you've carried this alone all this time?" To which Matt jounced, the weight of his secret pressing down on him like a physical burden, and he confessed that the fear of rejection, the implicit bouleversement it might beget, and the query of how Victor and Nikki would reply had kept him silent. But now, in the quiet of the Abbott manse, facing two of the people he trusted most, he felt the necessity and the urgency of speaking his verity, and as he spoke, his mind contended back to the innumerous moments in his life where the absence of answers had shaped his jest, his choices, and indeed his connections, the undetermined pressure leaving him vulnerable, restless, and searching for connection in ways he hadn't completely understood until now. And Jack, leaning back in his president, his fritters steepled and his brow furrowed in contemplation, counted the counter-accusations, fading not only the emotional graveness of Matt's disclosure, but also the strategic consequences for the Newman Abbot dynamics, the business battles, and the web of alliances that had long defined the swings of power in Genoa City, and he realized, with an admixture of pride and apprehension, that Matt's claim to the Newman heritage, whether conceded or queried, would shoot shockwaves through the megacity, affecting not just the Newmans and the Abbots, but nearly everyone who had ever been entangled in the complicated network of connections, backstabbings, and alliances that defined life in the city, while Diane, her feelings a swirling admixture of empathy, excitement, and concern, concentrated on the mortal side of the disclosure, thinking of Nikki and Victor and imagining the violent, complicated feelings they would witness upon learning that Matt, the youthful man whose life had been shrouded in secretiveness and query, was their son, the child of their love, their choices, and their retired opinions, and she knew that when that moment came, it would enkindle a waterfall of emotional competitions, affirmations, and, conceivably, rapprochements or ruptures, and Matt, seeing the graveness of the moment and the ripple goods yet to come, felt both intoxicated and alarmed, his heart racing as he imagined Victor's calculating mind anatomizing every word, anticipating every response, every implicit manipulation, every eventual concession or alliance, while Nikki, whose motherly instincts had always been finely tuned, would witness a swell of feelings so profound that it might review her sense of identity, her precedences, and indeed her connections with those around her, and in the midst of this emotional whirlpool, Matt allowed himself to flash back the foremost fractions of his life, the vague images of moments he slightly recalled, the transitory murk of recollections that now made sense, the inexplainable passions of craving and curiosity that had guided him toward the verity, and he realized that this concession was further than a disclosure of lineage. It was a recovery of his identity, a protestation that he was no longer willing to be defined by elision, secretiveness, or the manipulations of others, and Jack, his logical mind racing, began to consider how the knowledge of Matt's true lineage might shift the megacity's power dynamics, the alliances and jaundice that had sounded stationary now rendered fluid, the chessboard of Genoa City moving in changeable directions, and he allowed about the possible responses of Sharon, Phyllis, Lauren, and the myriad other players whose lives bisected with the Newmans and Abbotts in ways both profound and trivial, all of whom would be forced to review their own positions, commitment, and intentions, while Diane, seeing Matt's internal struggle, offered a quiet consolation, a memorial that the verity, while disruptive, was also liberating, a chance to reshape connections on a foundation of honesty rather than deception, and she could see in Matt's eyes the admixture of relief, fear, and resoluteness, the way he uncurled slightly, as if the simple act of speaking his verity had invested him with newfound strength, courage, and clarity, and as the hours stretched on, the pressure in the Abbott manse sounded nearly palpable, as if every piece of cabinet work, every oil, every window and curtain bore substantiation to the profound metamorphosis taking place. And Matt, encouraged by the measured, yet attentive, responses of Jack and Diane, began to outline the sequence of events that had led him to this point, the cryptic hints he discovered in Victor's once dealings, the retired letters from Nikki, the rumored exchanges he'd eavesdropped, and the subtle expressions that had spoken volumes long before words could, and he spoke with a vulnerability that was raw and authentic, admitting his dubieties, fears, and the loneliness of carrying a secret of similar magnitude, and he reported the emotional roller coaster, the moments of exhilaration and despair, the nights he'd scuffled with the possibility that he might no way know the verity, and yet, despite the fermentation, the imperturbable pull of identity and belonging had driven him to dig deeper, to connect the blotches, and to eventually defy the reality that had escaped him for so long, and as he spoke, Diane's eyes lustered with gashes, her heart paining for the boy who had suffered in silence, and yet swelling with pride for the man who had the courage to claim his verity, while Jack, whose instincts were generally directed toward strategy and control, set up himself moved by the mortal element, the sheer frippery it took to reveal oneself in the face of query, vulnerability, and implicit rejection, and as the discussion strengthened, The room sounded to palpitate with the emotional energy of disclosure, understanding, and expectation, a silent prelude to the ineluctable competitions with Victor and Nikki, whose lives would no way be the same once they learned of Matt's concession, and Matt, feeling the weight of his coming way, realized that while the verity had been spoken, the work was only beginning, that the megacity, the Newman conglomerate, and his own particular trip would now unfold in ways both changeable and necessary, and he allowed. Of Victor, imagining the admixture of pride, astonishment, and the strategic computation that would really color his response, a response that could range from joy to manipulation, from acceptance to conniving, while Nikki, whose heart had always been guided by love, suspicion, and an unyielding sense of morality, would be pulled in multiple directions. The motherly instinct to embrace Matt colliding with the complications of her own connections and the shadow of once miscalculations. And Matt, seeing the enormity of the emotional geography, braced himself for the rush of responses, the competitions, the affirmations of fidelity or opposition. And yet, despite the fear, there was a lightness, a clarity, a sense of eventually being aligned with the verity, no longer disintegrated by secretiveness or elision, and as the evening murk strengthened in the Abbott manse, Jack eventually spoke, his voice calm but establishment, admitting the courage it had taken for Matt to reveal himself, promising support and offering guidance for navigating the unfaithful waters that lay ahead, while Diane, her hand still resting gently on Matt's shoulder, corroborated the sentiment, reminding him that family, honesty, and love could endure indeed the most dramatic exposures, and together, in that quiet yet stimulating moment, they formed a fragile alliance of understanding, empathy, and strategy, a foundation upon which Matt could begin to reconstruct his life, connections, and sense of tone and outdoors. As Genoa City went about its evening, ignorant yet of the monumental news contained within the walls of the Abbott manse, the ripples had formerly begun, the unnoticeable vestments of gossip, suspicion, and enterprise sluggishly reaching out, intimating at the ineluctable competitions and exposures that would waterfall through the megacity in the days, weeks, and months to come. And Matt, standing at the threshold of a new chapter, took a deep breath, feeling the weight of heritage, the burden of secretiveness lifted, and the exhilarating, frightening possibility that he was now, eventually, completely himself, a youthful man with the blood of the Newmans flowing through him, connected to one of the most influential families in Genoa City, yet determined to sculpt his own path, claim his own identity, and navigate the complex, unfaithful, but incontrovertibly vibrant world that awaited him. And as the night strengthened, the lights of the Abbott manse casting long murk across the room, Matt allowed himself a brief smile, a moment of peace, knowing that while the megacity, his parents, and the world around him might reply in ways he couldn't yet prognosticate, he'd spoken his verity, embraced his lineage, and stepped bravely into the reality of who he was, a verity that, formerly revealed, could no way be undone, and that verity, shimmering like a lamp in the query of Genoa City, marked not just the end of secretiveness, but the morning of a new period, one filled with drama, love, battle, and the enduring, indelible spectacle that's life in the young and the restless. As the night wore on and the Abbott manse grew quiet, Matt remained standing, the adrenaline from his concession sluggishly declining, leaving in its wake a complex blend of relief, apprehension, and the electric expectation of what was to come. And Jack, pacing sluggishly now, his mind droning with plans, contingencies, and strategies, reminded Matt that while the verity had been spoken, the real challenge would be navigating the responses of Victor, Nikki, and the rest of Genoa City's intricate social web, while Diane, seeing the heaviness in the room, encouraged Matt to allow himself indeed a brief moment of calm, assuring him that disclosure, though disruptive, was the first step toward understanding, conciliation, and commission. And Matt, looking between the two of them, realized that he hadn't just confessed a secret but had planted the seeds of his own fortune, that the knowledge of his true lineage would ever alter his connections, his sense of tone, and the megacity's perception of him. And he allowed. Of Victor, imagining the admixture of shock, pride, and strategic computation that would inescapably dominate his response, while picturing Nikki, whose heart would contemporaneously swell with motherly love and grapple with the consequences of one's choices. And in that quiet, reflective moment, Matt also considered how this disclosure